Anthony was an old man now, with gray hair and deep lines etched into his face, the kind that only years of hard work and life experience could carve. He had retired from the police force over 20 years ago, but the habits and instincts of a cop never truly left him. For all his years in law enforcement, he never could shake the feeling that something was always just a little off in the world, and tonight, something felt terribly wrong. He lived in a small, cozy house with his wife, Martha, and their 20-year-old son, Tim. The house, tucked at the edge of town, always smelled of home, freshly baked bread or stew simmering on the stove. Every night they gathered around the dinner table, just the three of them, sharing stories of their day. It was a quiet routine, one Anthony had come to treasure more than he had ever expected. Martha had been a waitress at a diner before they married, and she had perfected the art of comfort food: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and fresh green beans that could make even the most difficult days seem bearable. This evening, like every other, Martha had outdone herself with a tender, golden-brown meatloaf. But as the clock ticked past the usual time for Tim to return home from his shift at the local supermarket, Anthony started to sense an unease creeping in. It wasn't like Tim to be late, and the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. Martha, always the more nurturing of the two, glanced at Anthony, her brow furrowed in concern. "I'll call him," she said, picking up her cell phone with a practiced hand. She dialed Tim's number, the ringing sound echoing in the stillness of the kitchen. After a few moments, the call went to voicemail. "Maybe he's just busy with something," Anthony suggested, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He didn't believe his own words. Martha redialed, but again, no answer. She let out a small sigh, worry clouding her features. "Maybe he just got caught up with something. I'll call the store." She called the supermarket where Tim worked, speaking briefly to the manager. The conversation didn't ease her fears. Tim had left the store over an hour ago, right on time for his shift to end. "Maybe he stopped at a friend's house?" Anthony offered, trying to convince both of them that there was a simple explanation. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Tim never stayed out late without telling them. Not like this. Martha didn't respond, her face pale as she quickly hung up the phone. "I don't know, Anthony," she said quietly, her voice tinged with unease. "He's never done this before. I'm going to drive around. Maybe I'll find him." Without waiting for an answer, she grabbed her coat, and Anthony, now more concerned than ever, grabbed his jacket. The two of them piled into their old car and drove through the familiar streets, the headlights cutting through the dark as they slowly circled the neighborhood, calling out his name into the night, though they knew it was futile. They drove up and down the same streets twice, 3 times, but there was no sign of Tim, no trace of him anywhere. By midnight, Anthony's patience had worn thin. The unease gnawed at him, a feeling he'd learned to trust over the years, even when it told him things he didn't want to hear. He reached for his phone with a steady hand, though his heart was racing. "This isn't like him," Martha whispered, the worry in her voice now palpable. "I know," Anthony replied, dialing the number that had always brought him answers when the situation was serious. 911. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. But when Anthony told them his son was missing, there was no reassurance. The operator promised to send an officer to their home right away, but Anthony could already feel the weight of the situation settling around them. Time, he knew, was slipping away. The minutes stretched into hours as they sat in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. Anthony, a retired cop who had seen more than his fair share of bad things in his time, suddenly found himself feeling helpless. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was supposed to be the one in control. What could have happened to Tim? Where could he be? Martha's eyes were red with worry, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table, waiting for something, anything, to break the unbearable silence. 2 police officers finally arrive. They ask a few questions and take notes, but they tell Anthony and Martha that it hasn't been 20 fits yet, so there's nothing they could do. The officers left. Anthony and Martha were disgusted. The night dragged on, but no answers came. Somehow, in the deep, foreboding quiet of that house, Anthony knew the man who had protected so many others might now find himself in the one place he'd never prepared for, waiting, helpless, to protect the one thing he loved most. But the worst was yet to come. Early the next morning, just as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Anthony was jolted awake by the sound of the front door creaking open. He sat up, blinking into the darkness, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Then he heard it, the unmistakable shuffle of Tim's boots across the floor. Anthony's heart caught in his chest. He glanced over at Martha, who was still asleep, her back to him. He swung his legs off the bed, his instincts kicking in, the years of his old profession sharpening his senses. Timothy had come home, but something wasn't right. Anthony waited a moment, then heard the soft thud of Tim's footsteps retreating toward his room. The door creaked open and shut again, leaving the house wrapped in an eerie silence. Anthony's gaze flicked to the clock. It was nearly 7 a.m. He slowly stood up and padded into the hallway, careful not to wake Martha. He could feel his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. Something about the way Tim had walked in, slow, almost robotic, had unsettled him. Anthony approached Tim's bedroom door, knocking gently. "Tim," he called softly. "Tim, are you okay?" There was no answer. The door was cracked open just enough for him to see his son, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. Tim's face was pale, his eyes wide but unfocused. His usual energy, his irreverence, had been replaced with an odd stillness. "Tim, where have you been?" Anthony asked, his voice low but firm, a note of concern creeping in. Tim didn't respond. Instead, he seemed to shudder slightly, his hands trembling as he rubbed his eyes. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked past his father, heading straight for the kitchen. Anthony stood frozen for a moment, uncertainty gnawing at him. "What the hell happened to him?" he muttered under his breath. He was about to follow when he heard the soft sound of Tim pulling a chair out and sitting at the kitchen table. Martha stirred from the bedroom just then, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She walked out into the hallway, looking up at Anthony. "What's going on? Is he okay?" "I don't know," Anthony said, his voice tight. "He came home in the middle of the night, just wandered in like a sleepwalker. He's acting strange. Won't answer me." They exchanged a look, an unspoken worry passing between them. By the time they made their way into the kitchen, Tim was already hunched over a plate, shoveling the leftover meatloaf from last night into his mouth with a vacant expression. He wasn't savoring it, wasn't making small talk as he usually did. He just ate, his movements slow and mechanical. "Martha's meatloaf still good, Tim?" Anthony asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed his unease. Tim didn't look up. He mumbled through a mouthful. Anthony's gut twisted. He needed to know what was going on, to find out where Tim had been, why he was acting this way. "Tim," he pressed, his voice firmer now. "Where were you last night? We were worried sick. You didn't answer your phone, and when we drove around, we couldn't find you." Tim's fork paused halfway to his mouth. For a split second, he blinked as if coming out of a fog, then looked at his father, but his eyes were distant, almost glazed over. I don't know," he said softly, his voice almost as though it wasn't his own. I'm not sure where I was." Martha, standing in the doorway, was still in her robe, her face filled with concern. "Tim, you've got to tell us what happened. We were so scared, honey." Tim didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the plate aside and stood up abruptly. He looked at his parents, his expression strangely vacant. "I'm just tired," he said in a monotone. "I'm going to lie down." Without another word, he shuffled back to his room, leaving the uneaten meatloaf behind, and closed the door with a soft click. Martha and Anthony stood there in the kitchen, both of them staring after their son, the unsettling silence between them now growing louder. "What the hell is going on, Anthony?" Martha finally whispered, her voice trembling. "He's never been like this. Never." Anthony ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. He had seen men in a daze before, after traumatic events, after a long shift, even in moments of mental strain. But there was something about Tim's blank expression, the way he couldn't even bring himself to talk about the night, that set off alarms in his head. "I don't know," Anthony said, his voice grave, "but I'm going to find out. Whatever happened to him last night? I need to know." Martha nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "You think it has something to do with that place? The supermarket?" "I don't know, but we're going to find out." Anthony's mind was already working, piecing together the fragments of the night before. He had to talk to someone at the supermarket. There had to be an explanation. But deep down, something told him this wasn't just about a late shift or a simple miscommunication. Something was wrong. And it felt bigger than anything he had ever dealt with in all his years as a cop. As the day stretched on, the uneasy feeling didn't dissipate. In fact, it grew stronger. Anthony was determined. Whatever had happened to his son, he would uncover the truth. But part of him feared that the answers they were about to find might be darker than he could ever have imagined. Anthony stayed in his bedroom all day. He didn't want to alarm Martha or Tim, but the gnawing feeling in his gut wouldn't let him rest. His mind kept circling back to the same question. What happened to Tim last night? The way his son had walked through the door, dazed, disoriented, haunted him. He'd been a cop long enough to recognize when something was off, and everything about Tim's behavior screamed that something wasn't right. Martha had come by the bedroom a few times to check on him. Each time she'd peeked in with concern, but he'd just told her he was fine, that he needed rest. She didn't press him. She knew better than to push Anthony when he had that look in his eyes, the look that said he was working through something, piecing together the puzzle in his head. She wanted to ask about Tim, wanted to know if he had any answers, but she didn't. Not yet. Around dusk, Anthony finally emerged from the bedroom. His face was haggard, his eyes dark with exhaustion, but his posture was steady, the same quiet strength that had served him well in all those years on the force. Martha was in the kitchen, quietly putting away the dishes from dinner. She glanced up at the sound of the door creaking open. "Anthony, you're up. Are you feeling better?" she asked softly, though she could tell by the look in his eyes that he hadn't been resting. "I'm not sure," he muttered, his voice heavy with something Martha couldn't quite place. He stepped into the kitchen, then paused as if searching for the right words. Martha set the dishcloth aside, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "What's going on, Anthony?" "I think I figured it out," he said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the living room where Tim had retreated earlier that day. "I think I know where Tim was last night." Martha's heart skipped a beat. "You do?" She wiped her hands on the dishcloth and turned fully toward him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. Anthony nodded, though there was a tightness in his jaw. "But it's not what I expected. It's worse." Martha stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, worse? Anthony, what happened?" He glanced down at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "I don't think Tim went anywhere last night. Not like we thought. I think he was taken." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unsettling. Martha's breath caught in her throat. "Taken? By who? What are you talking about?" Anthony's expression darkened as he paced slowly across the room. "I did some digging today. I called the supermarket again. The manager told me Tim had left work exactly on time, around 10:30, but he didn't come home. I kept thinking maybe he was just off with friends or something, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized there's no way he would have just disappeared like that. He's not that kind of kid." Martha's face went pale. "So you think someone took him? Last night?" "I'm not sure. But when I spoke to the manager, she mentioned something strange," Anthony continued, his voice low. She said that Tim seemed off yesterday at work. He was distracted, like he was in a daze. She thought he was just tired, but now I'm not so sure. Tim doesn't act like that, and he came home acting the same way, like he'd been sleepwalking or in some kind of trance. Martha felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing. What are you saying? What could make him act like that? I don't know yet, Anthony said, his voice tinged with frustration. But I'm going to find out. I think something happened to him, something he's not telling us. Maybe he doesn't even remember, but I'm going to find out what it was. Martha looked over toward the living room where Tim had curled up on the couch earlier, still acting strangely. She hesitated, then asked, "So, what do we do now?" Anthony looked at her, his eyes firm. "I'm going to talk to him, but this time, I'm not just going to ask him. I'm going to make him tell me the truth." Before Martha could respond, they heard the sound of footsteps in the hall. Tim appeared in the doorway, looking even more disheveled than he had earlier. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair mussed, and he was still wearing the clothes he'd been in the night before. He didn't look at either of them as he stepped into the kitchen, heading straight for the cabinet to grab a glass of water. Anthony and Martha exchanged a glance, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. "Tim," Anthony said, his voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." Tim took a slow sip of water, then set the glass down, finally meeting his father's gaze. His face was expressionless, almost blank, but there was a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, behind his eyes. "What about?" Tim asked, his tone flat. Anthony took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Tim's. "You've been acting strange ever since last night. We've been worried about you, and you're not telling us the truth. What happened, Tim?" Tim hesitated, his eyes darting toward the floor for a moment. His lips parted as if to speak, but then he closed them again. He looked at Anthony, then at Martha, then back at the floor. I don't remember much," Tim said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean you don't remember?" Anthony asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "You have to remember something." Tim took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly. "I don't know, Dad. I woke up in a different place. It wasn't home. I don't know how I got there." Martha's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, a different place?" "Tim, what are you saying?" Tim swallowed hard, his eyes shifting nervously. "I don't know. I woke up in the woods. Or, I think it was the woods. It was dark. There was a light. I heard voices, but they weren't like normal voices. I think I was sleepwalking or something, but I don't know how I ended up there." Anthony's heart raced. His instincts, honed by years of experience, were screaming at him. This was no coincidence. Something was happening. Something bigger than they realized. "We need to find out where you were, Tim," Anthony said, his voice low but urgent. "And I'm going to find out, no matter what it takes." But as Tim stared at his father, the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't something he wanted to talk about. And deep down, Anthony knew that whatever truth they uncovered, it would not be one they were ready to face. That evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Tim told his parents he was going out. He gave them the same excuse he always used, though tonight something felt different. He was too quiet, too distant. Anthony noticed the way his son avoided his eyes, the way his shoulders hunched as he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. "Where are you going, Tim?" Anthony asked casually, trying to mask the concern in his voice. "Just out for a bit, Dad." "Don't worry," Tim had replied before walking out without another word. Anthony's gut twisted with unease. The way Tim said it, almost too dismissively, set off alarms in his mind. Without a second thought, Anthony decided to follow. He wasn't going to sit idly by again, not after everything that had happened. He waited for a few minutes, then slipped quietly out of the house and into his car. He kept his distance as he tailed Tim's car down the winding roads, making sure to stay a few blocks behind. He watched as Tim turned off into a wooded area, parking his car at a small secluded park on the edge of the forest. The park was nearly deserted, save for a few scattered cars parked along the narrow, dimly lit lot. Tim sat in his car for a long time, staring out into the trees. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his face shadowed in the dim light of the dashboard. Anthony, parked a few spaces behind, kept a careful eye on him, wondering what Tim was doing, who he was waiting for. The minutes stretched into a strange, quiet lull. Then, suddenly, the stillness of the night was shattered by a loud, blood-curdling howl that came from deep within the forest. Anthony's heart skipped a beat. The sound was guttural, primal, sending a chill crawling up his spine. He squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of the noise. Was it an animal? A wolf, maybe. But it sounded wrong. Too human, too otherworldly. Tim seemed to hear it, too. He stiffened in the car, his eyes wide and alert, as if recognizing something that terrified him. Without hesitation, he threw open the car door and bolted out, running toward the tree line. "Tim," Anthony whispered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, Anthony was frozen, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to go after him, to chase after his son into the woods. But then a wave of caution washed over him. The forest was pitch black and he didn't have a flashlight. He couldn't risk getting lost or hurt, especially if there was something dangerous out there. His mind raced. He couldn't just let Tim go alone, but there was no time to think. Tim was already disappearing into the trees, his figure swallowed up by the darkness. Anthony hesitated for only a moment longer before reaching for his phone. "Martha," he said quickly, his voice tight. "I'm at the park." Tim just ran into the woods. I don't know what's going on, but something's not right. He could hear the panic in Martha's voice when she responded, "What do you mean something's not right? What happened? Where's Tim?" "Something's out there, Martha. Something strange. I'm staying in the car. I don't have a flashlight and I'm not going in there without knowing what's going on." Anthony's voice was calm, but inside, his nerves were firing. He wasn't sure if he was making the right choice by staying put, but he needed to think. Just be careful, Anthony," Martha said, her voice quivering. "Please, keep me posted." "I will," he promised, hanging up the phone. He leaned back in the seat, eyes fixed on the edge of the forest, straining to hear any movement. The minutes crawled by, stretching into what felt like hours. Anthony glanced at the clock. 20 minutes had passed, then 30, 40. Still, there was no sign of Tim. He called Martha again. "I'm still waiting, but Tim's not back yet," he said, his voice tight with worry. "Should you go in after him?" Martha's voice was full of concern. "I don't know, Martha," Anthony replied. "I don't know what's out there. I need to be sure." He scanned the darkness around him, trying to make sense of every rustling noise, every snap of a twig, but it was too quiet, too still. The woods felt like they were holding their breath. An hour passed, still no sign of Tim. His stomach twisted in a knot. The sound of that howl, the way Tim had run toward it. It was like he was drawn to it, as if he knew something Anthony didn't. Anthony's gut told him he couldn't wait any longer. He had to do something. But just as he was about to turn the key in the ignition, a sharp noise cut through the air. Another howl, this one closer, more intense than before. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't some wild animal. His mind raced with questions. Was it a person? Was Tim being led somewhere? Could he be in danger? But then a sinking realization gripped him. What if Tim wasn't the victim? What if, somehow, he had become part of whatever this was? Anthony took a deep breath, steeling himself, but the decision was already made for him. He couldn't wait any longer. He started the car, his hands trembling slightly as he shifted into gear, but before he could even move, a figure appeared in the clearing at the edge of the forest. It was tall, shadowy, and barely visible in the gloom. The figure stood still, watching the parking lot. "Who the hell is that?" Anthony's breath caught in his throat. His instincts kicked in, screaming at him to stay back, to stay safe. But he couldn't look away. He needed answers. Before he could move, the figure stepped forward into the faint light, and Anthony's heart stopped. It was someone he recognized. But it wasn't Tim. It was a man, tall, with an unshaven face and dark clothes, his features obscured by shadows. His eyes were glowing faintly in the dark, and in his hand he held something that shimmered, something that caught the faintest glimmer of light from the street lamps. The man's gaze flicked toward Anthony's car, locking eyes with him for a split second before he turned and walked further into the forest, vanishing into the darkness. Anthony's pulse raced. There was something wrong about that man, about all of it. Something dark, something unnatural. And now, with Tim still somewhere out there, Anthony knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening in those woods, whatever was drawing his son into the forest, it was only the beginning. He had to find Tim before it was too late. Anthony drove home, but his mind wouldn't let go of what he had seen. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Every detail played over and over in his mind like a broken record. The howl. Tim running toward the forest. That tall man standing there in the shadows with glowing eyes and a strange air about him. He seemed familiar, but Anthony couldn't place where he'd seen him before. The entire night felt like a blur, a mix of fear, confusion, and mounting dread. What was going on? What had gotten into Tim? And why had he run straight toward whatever that thing was? The more Anthony thought about it, the more unsettled he became. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger happening, something far darker than just a wayward kid or a strange encounter in the woods. When he pulled into the driveway, his headlights cutting through the dark and empty yard, he felt an almost crushing sense of urgency. He had to figure out what was going on before it was too late. He walked inside and found Martha sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of her. She hadn't gotten any sleep either. The worry was clear in her eyes. "How's Tim?" she asked, her voice shaky, though she didn't seem to expect a good answer. Anthony shut the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment before walking over to the table. He sat down heavily across from her, rubbing his temples. "He's still not back yet," he said, trying to steady his voice, but the tension was too much. "Martha, something's wrong, really wrong." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What happened, Anthony?" Anthony recounted everything he had seen at the park. The howl, Tim running into the woods, the strange man with the glowing eyes. His voice grew more intense as he spoke, every word weighed down by the dread building in his chest. He told Martha how he had seen the man before but couldn't place where, and how that connection gnawed at him, a sense of familiarity he couldn't shake. Martha's face grew more and more confused as he spoke. But who was that man? Why was Tim running toward him? "What is happening, Anthony?" "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But something's drawing him in. It's like he's not in control, like he's being pulled into whatever that is." Martha was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "This doesn't make sense. I don't know what to think anymore." She paused, looking up at him with desperation in her eyes. "What are we supposed to do?" Anthony met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I'm going to find out what's going on. I have some old contacts in the force, people who might know something." Martha nodded, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. "Please, be careful." Anthony stood up, grabbing his phone. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them by sitting around. He dialed the number of one of his old detective friends, a man named Carl who had worked with him on several cases during their time together on the force. Carl had always been the type to keep his ear to the ground, and Anthony knew if anyone had any information about strange things happening around the area, it was him. The phone rang 3 times before Carl picked up. "Anthony!" What's going on? Carl, I need your help, Anthony said immediately, not wasting any time. I'm looking into something strange, something involving my son, Tim. Last night I saw something in the woods, and I think there's something going on that I don't understand. I need to know if you've heard anything about a group of people who live near the park, in the woods. Do you know anything about them? There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a low sigh. I've heard rumors, Carl said, his voice cautious. You know how it is. People talk. A few years ago there was talk about a strange group that lived out in those woods. They were reclusive, weird, and they didn't take kindly to anyone poking around in their territory. They didn't come into town much, but the few times they did, they were odd. Real odd. Odd how? Anthony asked, his pulse quickening. Carl hesitated before continuing. They weren't like the typical survivalists or off-the-grid types. There were whispers about them being part of some cult or having strange beliefs. Some people thought they were just a bunch of conspiracy nuts, but others, they thought there was something more to it, something darker. I've heard rumors that they perform rituals out there in the woods. People said it was like they were trying to call something. A chill ran down Anthony's spine. He thought back to the howl, the eerie feeling that had gripped him when he'd seen that man in the woods, the glowing eyes, the sense that whatever was happening out there was beyond anything rational. What do you mean, call something? Anthony pressed. Anthony recounted everything he had seen at the park. The howl, Tim running into the woods, the strange man with the glowing eyes. His voice grew more intense as he spoke, every word weighed down by the dread building in his chest. He told Martha how he had seen the man before, but couldn't place where, and how that connection gnawed at him, a sense of familiarity he couldn't shake. Martha's face grew more and more confused as he spoke. But who was that man? Why was Tim running toward him? What is happening, Anthony? I don't know, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. But something's drawing him in. It's like he's not in control, like he's being pulled into whatever that is. Martha was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. This doesn't make sense. I don't know what to think anymore. She paused, looking up at him with desperation in her eyes. What are we supposed to do? Anthony met her gaze, his expression resolute. I'm going to find out what's going on. I have some old contacts in the force, people who might know something. Martha nodded, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. Please, be careful. Anthony stood up, grabbing his phone. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them by sitting around. He dialed the number of one of his old detective friends, a man named Carl who had worked with him on several cases during their time together on the force. Carl had always been the type to keep his ear to the ground, and Anthony knew if anyone had any information about strange things happening around the area, it was him. The phone rang 3 times before Carl picked up. Anthony? What's going on? Carl, I need your help, Anthony said immediately, not wasting any time. I'm looking into something strange. Something involving my son, Tim. Last night I saw something in the woods, and I think there's something going on that I don't understand. I need to know if you've heard anything about a group of people who live near the park, in the woods. Do you know anything about them? There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a low sigh. I've heard rumors, Carl said, his voice cautious. You know how it is. People talk. A few years ago there was talk about a strange group that lived out in those woods. They were reclusive, weird, and they didn't take kindly to anyone poking around in their territory. They didn't come into town much, but the few times they did, they were odd, real odd. Odd how? Anthony asked, his pulse quickening. Carl hesitated before continuing. They weren't like the typical survivalists or off-the-grid types. There were whispers about them being part of some cult or having strange beliefs. Some people thought they were just a bunch of conspiracy nuts, but others, they thought there was something more to it, something darker. I've heard rumors that they perform rituals out there in the woods. People said it was like they were trying to call something. A chill ran down Anthony's spine. He thought back to the howl, the eerie feeling that had gripped him when he'd seen that man in the woods, the glowing eyes, the sense that whatever was happening out there was beyond anything rational. "What do you mean, call something?" Anthony pressed. "I don't know. Like I said, it's mostly rumors. People talk about strange lights in the sky and things disappearing, people vanishing without a trace. It's not easy to get solid information, but the group has been there for years, as far as I know. Some people think they're connected to something otherworldly, and I don't mean just weird beliefs, Anthony. They believe they're tapping into something darker, something that comes from the forest itself." The hair on the back of Anthony's neck stood up. "You're saying they're involved in something supernatural?" Carl was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what it is, but I wouldn't go out there without a good reason. If Tim's involved in any of this, you need to be careful. These people, they don't play by the rules. They don't want to be found." Anthony felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He thought back to the way Tim had acted, almost as if he had been drawn to whatever was in the woods. Something wasn't right. He had to find Tim. He had to understand what was happening before it was too late. "Thanks, Carl. I owe you one," Anthony said, trying to keep his voice steady even though his mind was spinning. He hung up the phone and turned to Martha, who was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What did he say?" she asked quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Anthony took a deep breath. "There's a group out there. People who live in the woods. Carl didn't say much, but it sounds like they're involved in something dangerous. Something dark. And I think Tim's gotten mixed up in it." Martha's eyes filled with fear. "What do we do now?" "We find Tim," Anthony said, his voice firm, his resolve hardening. "And we get him out of there, no matter what." The storm inside him was only just beginning. Anthony knew that whatever lay ahead, whatever truth he uncovered in those woods, it would change everything. But there was no turning back now. The following night, as the full moon rose high over the darkened landscape, Anthony and Martha sat in the kitchen, barely speaking. Tim still hadn't returned. The fear and confusion gnawed at them both, but they knew there was only one thing left to do: find him. Anthony had spent the day gathering what little information he could. He'd spoken to Carl again, and though the detective's warning still echoed in his mind, Anthony couldn't just sit and wait anymore. His instincts told him that whatever was happening, Tim was in the thick of it. And the longer they waited, the further he might slip away from them. Martha stood up, her hands wringing together. "Anthony, we should go to the police. This is too much for us to handle alone." Anthony shook his head. "We can't. They'll just think we're overreacting. If we tell them about the woods, about this cult, they'll laugh us off. We have to find him ourselves." A silence settled over them, thick with fear and the sense that time was running out. Anthony stood, grabbed his jacket, and pulled on his boots. He had no real plan. He just knew that if Tim was still out there, he had to act fast. "I'll be back soon," he said, kissing Martha on the cheek. "Stay inside. Lock the doors." Martha didn't argue. She only nodded, her face pale with the weight of their shared fear. Anthony parked his car at the same secluded park, the headlights cutting through the night. The trees loomed dark and silent on all sides, their shadows stretching out like fingers trying to grab him. His heart pounded as he grabbed a flashlight from the back seat, his grip on it trembling. He wasn't sure what he expected to find out there in the woods, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. He stepped out of the car and paused for a moment, listening. The air was unnervingly still. No owls, no wind rustling the leaves, not even the distant sound of traffic. Just silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. He looked toward the forest. Somewhere out there, Tim was waiting. Or worse, something else was waiting for him. Anthony swallowed hard and began walking toward the edge of the woods, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. As he reached the tree line, He paused again. The howl. The memory of it echoed in his mind like a scream in the distance. Would it come again? He didn't know. He didn't want to find out. The flashlight beam flickered and then steadied. The air smelled damp, earthy, like the forest had absorbed all the secrets of the land. Anthony pressed on. The deeper he went into the woods, the more disorienting it became. The trees seemed to close in on him, their twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. His heart raced in his chest, but his focus never wavered. He had to find Tim. Suddenly, he heard movement ahead. A rustle, a low growl. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he raised the flashlight. The beam landed on something, or rather, someone, hunched in the shadows ahead. It was Tim, but not the Tim he knew. His son's face was pale, almost ghostly in the flashlight's glow. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on something in the distance, his expression vacant, as if he wasn't truly there. "Tim!" Anthony called out, his voice hoarse. Tim didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear his father. He was standing motionless, his body rigid, as if frozen in place by something unseen. "Tim!" Anthony shouted again, stepping forward. This time his son's head slowly turned toward him, but his eyes were different. They weren't Tim's eyes anymore. There was something in them, something dark, something otherworldly. Tim opened his mouth, but it wasn't his voice that came out. It was a low, rasping whisper, like an echo from the depths of the earth. "Don't follow me, Dad. It's too late." Anthony's chest tightened, his hands shaking. "What's happening to you, Tim? What are you doing out here?" Tim's lips twisted into a faint, hollow smile, but it was empty. The kind of smile you get when you've already given up. "I'm not in control, Dad. They've taken me. I can't stop it. You shouldn't be here. They don't like it when people come looking." Anthony stepped closer, reaching for Tim's arm. "No. Come with me, Tim. You're coming home now. We're going home." But before he could touch his son, a noise behind him made his blood run cold. A figure emerged from the trees. The tall man with glowing eyes. The man was even more unnerving in the light of the flashlight. His face was thin, sharp, with a jagged, unnatural smile stretching across his lips. The air seemed to grow colder as he stepped closer, his movements smooth and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "You shouldn't have come," the man said, his voice low and calm. "He's one of us now. He's chosen, just like the rest of them." Anthony's pulse hammered in his ears. He had to protect Tim, but he didn't know how to fight this. What was this man? What had he done to Tim? "No," Anthony said, his voice barely a whisper, his heart pounding. "I won't let you have him. I won't let you take my son." The tall man's grin widened. "It's already done, old man. You're too late." Before Anthony could react, the man raised his hand, and the air around them seemed to shift. The trees groaned. The ground beneath his feet trembled. It was as if the very forest itself was alive, watching him, waiting. Suddenly, Tim's eyes glazed over again. His body jerked as if waking from a trance, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He turned and ran toward the man, his feet moving as if he were being pulled by invisible strings. "No! Tim!" Anthony shouted, reaching out, but it was too late. The woods swallowed them both, and before Anthony could move, the darkness closed in around him. The next morning, the authorities arrived. They searched the woods for hours, but there was no trace of Tim, no sign of the tall man. They found nothing except the trees, the silence, and the unease that lingered in the air. They found Anthony, though. He was standing at the edge of the forest, his face pale, his eyes wide, his body shaking. But Tim was gone, and whatever had taken him, whatever had changed him, was still out there, waiting. In the weeks that followed, Anthony and Martha's lives were never the same. The quiet town began to change, too. Whispers started to spread. People who lived near the woods reported hearing strange howls in the night. Lights flickered in the forest and shadows seemed to move when no one was around. No one knew for sure what was happening out there, but they all felt it, the darkness creeping closer. And Anthony knew, deep down, that no matter how hard he searched, he would never find Tim again. Because whatever had taken him, whatever had called him to the woods had claimed more than just his son. It had taken a piece of his soul, too. And now it was watching him. Always.
Thanks for watching. Comment below.